A meteorite hurtles through space at tens of thousands of miles per hour towards Earth, ripping through our atmosphere so fast, air molecules don't have time to get out of the way. This increase in pressure heats the air and gradually vaporizes the surface of the massive space rock as it descends. Normally, this would be enough to destroy it before having the chance to bring devastation to our planet. But this one is different. Its size is just too big. It slams into the Earth, sending shockwaves and debris out in all directions that cause destruction for miles around. But this is not the end of this meteorite story. It is only the beginning. A mysterious sickness of origins unknown, a town in chaos, and suited government agents turning up to shut everything down. While this may sound like a trailer to an old sci-fi movie, it's not. What you're about to hear is a true story. And it all started on a relatively peaceful morning on September 15, 2007, in the tiny village of Carancas, Peru. Most of its residents were part of the Aymara, an indigenous group that had lived in the area for centuries. Its inhabitants were just about to have lunch when a 10-ton meteorite ripped through the atmosphere, burning at almost 1600 degrees Celsius, streaking flames and smoke across the sky. It was clearly visible despite the strong noontime sun. Their ceviche would have to wait. The meteor must have been a terrifying sight to those on the ground. They had simply never seen anything like this in their lives. High up in the Altiplano, there was little to do but tend to their flock, farms, and families. The meteor screeched through the sky closer to the town until, finally, it smashed into the ground, kicking up dirt and debris in the process. The ground beneath it, and Carancas itself, shook. If there were those who failed to spot it soaring across the sky, they would have surely noticed it now. And notice it, they did. A local villager, Romulo Quispe, was standing near enough to be thrown off his feet by the shockwave, sent flying back as far as 3 meters. The windows of a nearby health center shattered. 74-year-old Justina Limache, a shepherd, was tending to her flock of alpacas when the meteor struck. The shockwave terrified her so much that she rushed back home to make sure that her 8-year-old granddaughter was safe. Even after she arrived, rocks continued to rain on her roof for several minutes. The home of Javier Sarmiento, about 150 meters away, was damaged by the impact's falling debris, leaving dents and collapsing a part of his roof. Gregorio Uri, a local farmer, was out on his porch, taking a break from tending to his sheep. The meteor's force of impact was so great that he was momentarily stunned. When he finally managed to gather enough strength to stand up, he noticed a thick column of smoke in the distance. The smoke alarmed the villagers of Carancas. Several thought that there was a fire since there was a large pillar of smoke, and they feared that the blaze would inevitably spread to their houses. They were frightened and confused, wondering what was going on. Many of them were understandably too shell-shocked to do anything, but Gregorio gathered his wits and sped to the point of impact on his bicycle. There, he discovered the crash site. A crater about 50 feet across. He could feel the heat emanating from the crater. Upon looking over the edge, he saw a murky pool of liquid bubbling at the bottom. In addition, he could smell a sharp, noxious scent in the air. The surrounding area was not spared. The ground was covered in dust, along with scattered debris from whatever just crashed there. That mysterious red dust from another world reminds me of something else. Stardust corruption seeping through rift portals that link us to another dimension, spiraling us into a world of nightmarish creatures and deviations beyond comprehension. From the game Once Human, this video's sponsor. This exciting, surreal, post-apocalyptic survival shooter is now on mobile. If you love open worlds like Genshin Impact, but always wished the world was darker, stranger, and crawling with things that shouldn't exist, then you may have just found your game. This free-to-play, not pay-to-win open-world game is going to be the full experience in your pocket. Not only is it just like the PC version, but it's cross-platform too. So it means more ways to explore twisted landscapes, battle bizarre monstrosities, and choose your path. PvE if you prefer cooperative survival, or PvP if you want to take your chances against other players in a collapsing world where mutated, twisted death is around every corner. Scavenge, craft, build, and fight, with your friends or alone, if you dare. The best part, there's a gigantic reward for new players. 1,016 premium items for free. It helps you get past that early grind and progresses you by 2 months. So click down below to play Once Human and get the over 1,000 premium freebies right away. Whether it released Stardust pollution or something else entirely, the authorities had to be alerted. Gregorio borrowed a nearby motorcycle and made his way to Desaguadero, about 11 kilometers away. The town was home to about 20,000 people, and it was situated right along the border between Peru and Bolivia. This made it a bustling hub for travelers and merchants alike. Once there, he alerted the police to what had just occurred. Gregorio returned to Carancas with the authorities in tow. A large crowd had already gathered around the crater, and the bubbling pool had now simmered down. Many of the villagers, including Gregorio, were picking up rocks to keep. It was a rare occurrence after all. It's not every day that something from space smashes into your own backyard. The police collected their own samples as well to show Maximiliano Trujillo, the mayor of Carancas, who had only seen the flaming object in the sky. The chief handed him one of the samples, which, according to some reports, appeared to be emitting some kind of smoke. Neither the chief nor Trujillo had a clue what it was. The locals of Carancas were confused, and news of the incident quickly spread through all of the Altiplano. Many of them began to panic. Many were worried that more fire would rain down on them at any moment. It was as if the long-foretold apocalypse was finally upon them. Many retreated into their homes to do the one thing they could: pray. But one man named Vicente was at a bar when he heard and felt the meteor crash. He paused for a moment, then promptly ordered another beer. He had more important things to do than investigate whatever that was. And perhaps that had been the right choice, because in reality, the impact was the least of their worries. Something sinister began to stir amongst the people close to the crater. A mysterious illness began to spread. The local livestock were bleeding out of their noses. People were experiencing headaches, nausea, and dizziness, while some even began to vomit. The hospitals and clinics in the area were suddenly filled with patients, pushing them to their breaking point. Gregorio's son even called and warned him not to touch the rocks, exclaiming that they were contaminated. His warning came too late though. Gregorio already pocketed some stones. The swiftness at which this mysterious illness spread further stoked fears. Some worried that they were radioactive or carried some alien disease, while the especially superstitious felt that these rocks were just plain cursed. It might have been easy to dismiss them, but their fears had precedence. In 1984, the Allen Hills 84001 meteorite was believed to contain what appeared to be fossils of microbial life from early Mars. This made headlines across the world. Even the then President Bill Clinton made a speech about the discovery. But over the years, scientists have cast doubt on the evidence, which include non-biological explanations of errors when handling the samples. Still, the idea that microorganisms could survive a journey across space and land on Earth remained as a possibility within the scientific community. So, could this have been contaminated with an extraterrestrial virus, a real-life Andromeda strain? Their paranoia began to grow, and many assumed that their water source was contaminated too. It wasn't just them getting sick after all. Why else had their animals fallen ill? They refused to drink the water. By now, the cases at the overburdened hospitals and clinics ballooned to about 200 people. Jorge Lopez, a local health director, visited the site to investigate and also fell ill, suffering from a runny nose and an itchy throat. Things had gotten so out of hand that local authorities were considering declaring a state of emergency. Halfway across the world, word of the mysterious crater began to spread, and rumors circulated online. The mysterious illnesses, peculiar smell, and the remote nature of the incident made it easy for various wild theories to emerge. Some thought that it was a US spy satellite that had crashed. Others speculated that it was just some sort of natural volcanic activity or a sinkhole. Eventually, these theories would find their way to three individuals: Mark Farmer, Robert Ward, and Moritz Karl. They were just the kind of men suited for a mystery such as this. They were meteorite hunters. Ward and Farmer were partners and close friends. They collected meteorite samples all over the world: Argentina, India, Kenya, Morocco, you name it. They did their best work in deserts. You see, meteorites are darker than ordinary rocks, which make them that much easier to spot in the large, empty expanses of light sand deserts. They'd stick out like sore thumbs. In Antarctica, which is also technically a desert, about 50,000 meteorites are found each year. Farmer was the more physically imposing of the pair, standing at 6'2" and weighing 250 pounds. He loved to talk, tell stories, and held a liberal outlook on life. In contrast, Ward was rather stoic and conservative. He was often decked out in expensive expedition gear and a cowboy hat, which earned him the nickname Space Cowboy. While meteorite hunting isn't usually lucrative, they'd made thousands selling moon rocks and made a cool million selling a large, rare meteorite called a palisite. They weren't just hobbyists, they were modern-day Indiana Jones on the hunt for boundless space treasure. In their fearless pursuit of meteorites, as any adventurer would, they'd encountered danger at every corner. They were once kidnapped by communist FARC revolutionaries during a trip to Colombia, and they were robbed at gunpoint with a bag over their heads and machete at their throats in Kenya. During a journey to the mountains of Morocco, Farmer enlisted the help of local Tuaregs and hid in the back of a vegetable truck just so he could make it to Algeria to chase a meteor. An hours-long chase by the military ensued through dangerous minefields. Farmer had even faced prison time in the Middle East for illegal mining activity. In short, they'd go wherever and do whatever it took if it meant they could get their hands on meteorites. They were the dedicated sort, and the moment they found out what had just happened in Carancas, the duo immediately decided to make the long journey to Peru. They were joined by their mutual friend, Carl, who loved to read, smoke, and more importantly, chase meteors. They had to move fast. While there were only about 100 serious hunters in the world, they would have likely heard about the impact too. In this cutthroat game, meteorite hunters would do anything for an advantage, even hire someone to spy on the competition. So now the trio were in a race against time. Back in Carancas, medical professionals from the International Red Cross and the local health organization were in full force attempting to get to the bottom of what was causing the mysterious illness. Blood samples were taken from those with symptoms, as well as soil and water samples from the impact site. The crater itself was an oddity, a puzzle that didn't seem to have any corner pieces. You see, when a meteor enters Earth's atmosphere, the air in front of it compresses and heats up considerably. Little by little, this heat strips away the outer layers until it becomes a fraction of its former size. A great majority of meteors that make it to the ground end up very small, no larger than the size of a grain of sand. Upon impact, a meteor would need to be at least the size of a basketball to produce a significant crater. Scientists found countless shards of fragile rocky material, telltale signs that whatever made this crater was most likely a chondrite, which was the most common type of a stony meteor. But these fragile meteors typically break apart in the upper atmosphere. They usually never make craters of this size. In fact, before Carancas, there were only 9 other identified craters of a similar size, all of which were made by more robust, iron-rich meteors. Another point of confusion was the fact that the pool of water appeared to boil up for up to an hour after the crash, and emitted a strange odor, neither of which are typical of a meteor impact. A meteorite's surface layer may reach super high temperatures, but that usually burns off, and what remains, its interior, is as frigid as outer space. The fact that the meteorite and its fragments appeared to be emitting gas only compounded the mystery. Superstitious explanations for what was happening had a stranglehold over this small community. A majority were certain that spirits were at work, despite assurances from scientists, such as geologist Luisa Macedo, that the crater was safe. To try and ease some of their worries, officials from the Peruvian Nuclear Institute came over with scanners and instruments to show that there was no radiation. Unfortunately, this did little to diminish their fears. Trujillo, hoping to calm the nerves of his constituents, held a meeting at the Carancas communal house, a bare structure held together by old stone walls. 800 people attended the meeting, as did several village elders. Trujillo explained that he had already met with the scientists and key persons sent to survey the site. He assured them that there was nothing supernatural going on. A meteorite had simply fallen in their backyard. It was a rare occurrence, to be sure, but nothing otherworldly was at work. Some accepted this explanation, but a good number also remained unconvinced. You see, the land in Carancas was harsh. Crops were difficult to grow, so the villagers relied on animals, mostly sheep, alpaca, and vicuña. In short, because of their struggles, this was a deeply traditional land, with many respecting the old ways. They held the belief that all aspects of nature, mountains, rivers, lakes, and the skies, were represented by gods, and angry gods and spirits seemed to explain everything that happened, regardless of what people in lab coats and suits said. Trujillo set up a fence around the crater to dissuade further attempts to approach it. If it really was the cause of the mysterious illness, it was best if no one else wandered close to it. He also enforced 12-hour guard shifts. Every able-bodied member of the community needed to serve, or else one of their prized family animals would be taken away. With so many questions and so many uncertainties, it was all Trujillo could do, for now. The date was September 29th, 2007, about 2 weeks after the meteor impact in Carancas. Farmer, Ward, and Carl arrived in La Paz and took a taxi to Desaguadero. Time was of the essence. They weren't the only ones that had their eyes on this mystery crater after all. When they arrived in Desaguadero, Farmer, Ward, and Carl went to the local Peruvian police. Farmer did most of the talking, as he was the only one who knew some amount of Spanish. He explained to them that he and his companions were there to see the meteorite that had crashed nearby. The police took out a few of the rocks that they had collected, and the trio purchased them on the spot. The police agreed to take them to Carancas, but on the way there, they warned them to be wary of the villagers. Due to the remote nature of the community, it isn't uncommon for them to institute their own brand of justice, which often meant burning any serious offenders alive. The officers subtly suggested that they would need protection that they could provide. Unbeknownst to them, just a day earlier, another meteorite hunter had already come through the area. Robert Haag, a rival of farmers, had slapped a makeshift PA device on the roof of a rented car and drove around, announcing that he would buy any meteorites the locals had on hand. But as he tried to leave with his collection of rocks, a group of locals surrounded his car with crowbars. He barely managed to escape back to Bolivia with his life. The three meteorite hunters eventually made it to the crater at Carancas. Farmer approached the guard on duty and explained that they were here to see the big hole. The guard was skeptical at first, wary even, given that Farmer had a few policemen in his company, but Farmer convinced him that they were just here to figure out what the hole was. This was an innocent enough claim, so the guard stepped aside and let Farmer through the gate. Ward and Carl followed him inside, and together they examined the large crater and the ejecta, the spread of mud, clay, and debris, which went out as far as 360 meters southwest of the impact site. This confirmed reports that the meteor was spotted traveling east to the west before it crashed in Carancas. Carl and Farmer were barely able to keep still with excitement as they examined the ejecta. The small fragments had distinctive shock veins, patterns on the inside that indicated they were definitely chondrite, also confirming earlier reports. This went against established convention that brittle chondrite meteorites could not survive atmospheric entry. While Ward surveyed the area with a metal detector, the real prize was at the bottom of the pool. While many of the villagers, policemen, and curious visitors took fragments for themselves, the total amount recovered was no more than a few kilograms. This meant that a bulk of the meteorite was likely still submerged. However, the green, murky water was too opaque to see through, and Farmer realized that they'd need some real heavy machinery to get to the rest of the meteorite. And if they were going to do it, they'd have to do it fast. Chondrite was porous, and given enough time, it would eventually disintegrate in the water. 2 weeks had already passed, which meant that they didn't have long. Fortunately for them, they were approached by the mayor, Trujillo, who was keen to dispel the fears of the villagers. He realized that Farmer, Ward, and Carl knew a lot more about the meteorite than he did, and there was a good chance that they were the answer to his problems. Farmer assured him that he would help in that regard. All he needed was permission to drain the water. Trujillo was open to the idea, but it wasn't his call to make. Farmer would have to convince the inhabitants of Carancas, especially the elders. The following morning, about 100 people arrived at the communal house to hear Farmer speak. He explained their plans to excavate what was at the bottom of the hole. He also explained that they were in a race against the clock due to the fragility of the meteor. The residents were worried that doing so would worsen the mysterious illness, but Farmer guaranteed that the rock from space was not toxic in any way. It was not a curse or some supernatural blight. This was an opportunity for tourism, for the benefit of the community. Trujillo was inclined to agree. He saw the crater as a chance to really put Carancas on the map. He even entertained the idea of building a museum around it and to construct viewing platforms for the nearby Inca sites to draw in tourists. When the conversation reached this point, the residents were heavily against involving the government in any way. Peruvian officials and authorities had a talent for siphoning funds from them. They insisted that farmers should only do business with their elders and no credit cards, cash only. Farmer agreed to their terms. The villagers, though excited about the prospect of becoming a tourist destination, took about an hour to deliberate amongst each other. Ultimately, they also agreed to Farmer's request to drain the water and pull out the meteorite, but only if the spirits agreed. They would call in a shaman to commune with the spirits, who would decide if the foreigners could do as they pleased. The last thing they wanted was to make this plague worse. Trujillo, as well as a handful of scientists, were of the opinion that this illness was some form of mass hysteria. This can manifest in a group believing that they are suffering from an illness that doesn't exist, and even shows some symptoms, like the dancing plague of 1518. Hundreds of citizens of Strasbourg danced uncontrollably, many to their deaths, and was believed to be a case of mass hysteria. But it wasn't just the residents who got sick. Scientists, doctors, and police officers that were around the site were also affected. Not to mention the animals who bled from their noses weren't susceptible to mass hysteria. Many more theories were put forward: sulfur, arsenic, radiation, and even toxic mud volcanoes, but it was unclear if any were the culprit. The next day, Farmer, Ward, and Carl joined several hundred people around the crater. They watched with bated breath as the shaman, Arequipa, set up an altar at the edge of the site where he placed dried leaves, flowers, and spices. He chanted as villagers gave up their own offerings of candy and coca leaves. Arequipa ignited the leaves, and the blazing fire spread among the other offerings. Ordinarily, a llama heart was demanded as a sacrifice to ensure a plentiful harvest, but there was something that appeared to be far more sinister at work here, which would require something bigger. He reached inside a bag and pulled out a llama fetus, whose fur was matted and dried. He held up the animal for all to see, then, after a short pause, cast it into the fire. Following this act, he made a plea with Pachamama, the Incan goddess of the earth and fertility, to forgive him. The trio watched as Arequipa fanned the flames on the altar, sending smoke swirling into the air. The seconds turned into minutes, and as the fire petered out, so did the smoke. Arequipa stood up and looked around. There was no sign of disturbance. Pachamama had spoken. Farmer, Ward, and Carl were free to excavate the crater site. There was nothing stopping the three meteorite hunters now. They had a heavy-duty water pump brought in from Desaguadero to drain the pool and reveal whatever was hiding at the bottom. Farmer and Ward could hardly wait to get their hands on the meteorite. That is, if there was anything left of it. The water pump sucked out the water at a sluggish pace, as though sipping soda from a straw. However, while this was going on, several cars arrived on the scene. Most were local politicians from Puno, the capital city of the region. Exactly the kind of people that the villagers wanted nothing to do with. Their presence was reinforced by a heavy security detail, though they were not the friendly faces that Farmer and his companions were familiar with. A man with a loudspeaker began to shout, but the loud, steady hum of the water pump prevented the trio from hearing what was going on before it was too late. Farmer finally realized once the workers turned off the water pump. The local authorities had asserted that the crater and whatever was inside it was under their jurisdiction. This was exactly the scenario that the villagers of Carancas wanted to avoid. Things began to get rowdy, really rowdy, as they argued over who had ownership. The legality of collecting fallen meteorites varies between countries. If such laws exist at all, there are often no laws because they aren't of interest to national governments. But if the meteorites bring in money, that interest can change instantly. In Morocco, commercial dealings regarding meteorites are in the upwards of millions of dollars. In Oman, one needs a special license before they are cleared for taking any meteorites they may find. In the United States, ownership of a meteorite falls upon whoever owns the land it crashes on. Therefore, it can be easy to twist the law and accuse meteorite hunters of smuggling. Things began to get ugly between the crowd and government agents. The crater was almost empty, and it wouldn't be long now until Farmer could spot the earth underneath. Ward took it upon himself to try and start the pump again. Consequences be damned. Farmer tried to convince his partner that this was a bad idea. Respectfully, Ward disregarded his warning, climbed the fence, and restarted the machine. The eyes of the locals and officials snapped toward the meteorite hunters. Farmer assessed the situation, and it didn't exactly take a genius to tell that they were no longer wanted there. Everyone knew that the meteorite was valuable, and everyone was eager to grab a slice of this space pie. The water pump was shut down once more, and water started flooding back into the crater. With the atmosphere as hostile as it was, the trio fled the scene. Farmer, Ward, and Carl returned to Desaguadero. They had at least managed to obtain a few meteorite chunks here and there, but they failed to get their hands on the real prize. To make matters worse, when they returned to town, the police were waiting for them. Their passports were confiscated, and they were taken to the precinct to be interrogated. The friendly officers from before were no more. Farmer was asked why he was there, but he knew that Peru didn't have any laws for meteorites. Ultimately, the police could do little. They returned the trio's passports and allowed them to leave, but the officers made it clear that they would be keeping a close eye. Unfortunately, soon they would learn that other police officers would use the absence of certain laws to their advantage. That evening, in defiance of the police warnings, Farmer, Ward, and Carl snuck out of their hotel to scout out the border checkpoint. But once there, they were confronted by a police officer in plain clothes who asked, perhaps tauntingly, what they were doing out so late. The group, alarmed, went back to their hotel and began to pack. It wouldn't be long until things took a turn for the worse, especially with the police all over their case. This was a stark contrast from the warm reception they had just days earlier. And a turn for the worse did come. Later, at 4 in the morning, they heard a knock on the door. Farmer cautiously opened it and came face to face with two officers, demanding that he give them $2,000. Farmer refused such a ridiculous request, and the police simply smiled. They would come back for all their money, they warned. They even gloated and told the trio there was no hope of leaving town. The border of Bolivia was blocked, and the main police force from Lima were already on their way to arrest them. So Farmer, Ward, and Carl had no other choice but to flee their hotel, leaving several of their belongings behind. They headed out on foot toward the market square. At the end of the road, just as the police officers had warned, was a battalion of police blocking the way into Bolivia. Fortunately, they had other options. Farmer had located an alternative border crossing about 50 miles to the north. Farmer approached a nearby taxi, flashed several $100s, and confided that he and his friends needed to leave right away. The driver nodded and opened the trunk without asking any questions. They loaded the few belongings they could grab and climbed inside. The taxi sped away, but the police spotted them. One of the officers desperately chased after the taxi, even vaulting over a chicken cart, but the taxi got away. On the highway, just when they seemed home free, a police officer on the side of the road flagged the taxi down. Next to the officer was a sharply dressed man. The taxi driver complied and slowed down his vehicle to a stop. The trio held their breath, fearing they would be arrested. The driver argued with the officer and the man before speeding off. They learned from the taxi driver that the sharply dressed man was a politician and he just wanted a ride. It had nothing to do with the meteorite hunters. They could breathe again. Eventually, they arrived at the border crossing near the shore of Lake Titicaca. There, the trio boarded a ferry headed for Bolivia, and they were safe at last. Upon checking into their hotel, they discovered an email from the US Embassy in Peru. The local newspaper had claimed that the three of them were arrested, and said if they needed any assistance, they should contact the embassy at once. 2 months later, Peter Schultz visited the Carancas site. As a professor of geological sciences at Brown University and an expert on extraterrestrial impacts, he studied the meteorite and the mysterious plague. From his expertise, it seemed, the meteorite was once part of the asteroid belt, orbiting between Mars and Jupiter, before being bumped towards Earth. It was made up of mostly chondrite with other minerals. It was not, as many believed, filled with toxic substances. When it smashed into the soil in Peru, it was traveling at roughly 24,000 kilometers per hour, about 40 to 50 times faster than it should have been. Scientists have long thought these fast-moving meteorites would have shattered to pieces when hitting the atmosphere, which led many in the community to believe that the Carancas crater was a hoax. But Peter didn't think it was. He hypothesized that as the meteor broke up in the atmosphere, the fragments could not leave the shockwave barrier that formed around the falling rock as it entered, which caused it to reshape into something more aerodynamic, like a football. This, he believed, is why so much of the chondrite meteorite survived the entry and impact, and why it left such a large crater in its wake. The people of Carancas eventually stopped feeling sick. The blood samples that were taken earlier found some of them had dangerously high levels of arsenic, about 200 milligrams. The samples from the crater, water wells, and soil also showed high levels of arsenic. The most likely explanation for the illness is that when the meteor made impact, it superheated this highly toxic material, causing it to seep into the groundwater that the locals and animals drank. At the same time, it also caused vaporized arsenic to spread into the air, which is why those closest to the crater began to feel sick first. However, another team of researchers discovered that the hospitals were practically empty the first days after the meteor impact. One nurse reported that there was a false rumor spreading that those with symptoms from the crater impact would get free healthcare. Despite not being true, suddenly 200 people came forward. Not to mention, when studying the arsenic levels, the arsenic in the water wells were much higher than in the crater, and of those testing positive for arsenic in their blood, many were never near the crater. So while still inconclusive, it may have been a mix of rumors about free healthcare, mass hysteria, and arsenic in the water. Luckily, no deaths were reported. In the end, the crater was never drained. Whatever material that was submerged underneath likely disintegrated, perhaps before Farmer, Ward, and Carl even arrived. Trujillo's dream of opening a museum around the meteorite never came to fruition, and the crater just became another oddity of this remote village, high up in the mountains. What happened to the daring trio of meteorite chasers, you might ask? Farmer continues to hunt meteorites all across the globe, and he shares his exploits on his Instagram page. His longtime partner, Ward, also maintains this discipline to the present day, sometimes even giving lectures on the subject. And Carl Moritz remains a committed meteor chaser, with his own shop, Mo's Meteorites. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other videos, like this one about a man who was happily cooking in his kitchen when he suddenly began coughing up blood and later died in hospital. It was only after his death that doctors discovered that he had been hiding something, a secret that makes this case the strangest medical mystery we have ever covered. Click the video on your screen to watch now. And don't forget to check out Once Human by clicking the link in the description below and get over 1,000 premium freebies right away.